there are no ancient sources. I mean, you asked me how do I know this. I've read all of the ancient sources. There are no ancient sources that say anything about Jesus going to India.
Yeah, I just find, given the stature of this man, that the fact that there was zero written about him in those 18 years is very suspicious to me. I just think there must have been a deletion somewhere. I mean, yeah. Why didn't somewhere in the Bible it said, well, from the age of 12 he just spent the time with his father in his shop and doing this and that, and then all of a sudden emerged at 30 and did all these miraculous things. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
My question concerns essentially languages. If I understand correctly, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I've done a little bit of work, most of what is written is from 30 years, the earliest would be some of the earlier letters of Paul, to 60 and further on years later after Christ passed on, much of which is either in Greek or in Latin. And in spite of what the governor of Texas was purported to have said in about 1923 in a trial on bilingual languages, they had that same problem when she threw a Bible down and said, if English was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for our students. I suspect that Jesus didn't speak English and actually spoke the language of the common people, since he was actually trying to talk to the common people, which, if I understand correctly, in first century Palestine was Aramaic. And there are very few Aramaic texts around. So could you comment on what's missing between what was actually said and the codices that we're actually trying to decode, and with no reference to Da Vinci Code here, decode as being what he might have said. Yes. In fact, I don't believe he spoke English, so he did not say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. No. And in fact, I think Neil Douglas Klotz and a bunch of others in this Aramaic movement are trying to do something along these lines. So could you comment on that and where you stand there?
Yeah, so, no, it's absolutely right. Jesus spoke Aramaic. My opinion is that he did not know Greek, and that he did not know Latin. I think he probably knew Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek, so already when you're reading the Gospels in Greek, you're a step removed from the words of Jesus, assuming that the words that are being recorded are actually words that he said, because they're written 30 or 40 years later, and maybe some of these words weren't things that he actually said. There are sayings in the Gospels that make better sense if you retranslate them into Aramaic from Greek. I mean, it's tricky to do. I mean, but it's fun too. So so give you an example. There's a saying that doesn't make very good sense in Mark chapter 2. I'll use the sexist phrasing of this because it's the one people are familiar with, and it's one that it's easier to make my point. Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Okay? Sounds like familiar. But it doesn't make any sense. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. What's the therefore? Because it doesn't work. Well, but if you say it in Aramaic, the word for man, meaning human being, and the word for Son of Man is the same word, Barnashah. Sabbath was made for Barnashah, not Barnashah for the Sabbath. Therefore, Barnashah is Lord of the Sabbath. That makes sense. So you retrovert it into Aramaic, and it adds up. And there are other sayings, just as a side, so you need to do that, actually, if you're doing the historical Jesus study. The other side of that is, there are some things that cannot be retroverted back into Aramaic, which means Jesus probably didn't say them. Give you a famous example. Every World Series behind home plate, you get somebody holding up a sign, John 3:3. You must be born again. This is a very interesting passage that people holding these signs don't realize the linguistic problems, which is this. When Jesus says this in the Gospel of John, he says, a person must be born anothen to see the kingdom of heaven. Anothen is a Greek word. Now, the word anothen is interesting because it actually has two meanings. It can mean from above, or it can mean a second time. Okay, it means both things. And you have to decide which it means depending on the context. Nicodemus misunderstands what Jesus says. Jesus is saying you have to be born from heaven to see the kingdom of heaven. And Nicodemus thinks, I've got to go crawl back into my mother's womb and be born a second time? And then Jesus corrects his mistake. No, 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 no. And he tells him what he meant the first time. So the conversation hinges on the double entendre of this word anothen, the Greek word anothen. And you cannot reproduce the double entendre in Aramaic. So the conversation hinges on a particular Greek word that doesn't have a parallel in Aramaic, which means the conversation couldn't have happened like that.
Yeah,
so,
How about Hebrew?
No Hebrew either. Yeah. But they weren't speaking Hebrew in Jesus' day. Jesus probably could read Hebrew, I think, but they weren't. It wasn't a spoken language in Palestine in his time. Yes.
I have two questions. The first one is, how would you compare the copyists of the Sophorim copyists with those of the early Christians, which you've made a great point on?
You're asking about Jewish scribes from the Middle Ages. You're asking about?
No, those are Masoretes. I'm talking about the copyists in Ezra's time.
Oh, yeah. We don't know. I don't think we know. What a lot of people say when I give a talk on this about the New Testament is they point out that what they say is, well, Jewish practices were to copy everything meticulously, exactly, and they're usually thinking about the Masoretes. In the Middle Ages, there were Jewish practices that were extremely meticulous, but I don't think we know very much about copying practices in antiquity, especially in the Persian period, because we just don't have the kind of evidence we need.
Thank you. The second question was, may I have your autograph?
Yes, you may. I'm going to take one more question because this fellow, and then I'm going to stop.
Yes. In some of the ancient cultures, there were oral traditions that seemed to be designed to preserve a certain passages orally very exactly. Is there any evidence from early Christian times that there in some corner of Christendom such traditions were there, and what would they say about the passages?
Yes, were oral traditions such that the traditions were being kept intact over the years with the retelling. And there have been New Testament scholars who've argued that Jesus was a rabbi who taught his disciples certain things, and they memorized these things so they passed them along without changing them orally. That idea has run into trouble on two grounds. One is that there have been anthropological studies of oral societies that have shown that in most oral cultures it actually doesn't work the way we would think it would work. Well, the way we think it would work is that if you can't write something down, that you'd probably want to remember it exactly because you don't have a way of writing it down, so you'd want to remember it exactly. But that idea that you would want to remember it exactly, in fact, is a product of written cultures. In oral societies, that isn't how they think, because they think, most people in oral cultures know that in an oral presentation, you change the story depending on the audience, the situation, the need at hand, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. The other thing is that there's a way to check whether the stories about Jesus were being passed along without changing or being changed orally, and that's the fact that we have several different authors who have written down the things Jesus allegedly said and did, and you can compare them with one another. And when you do that, there are discrepancies. So it looks like people are changing the stories, both orally and at the written stage, I think. Okay, I need to stop there. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you.
Thank you for an extraordinary evening. Thank you, Professor Ehrman, for bringing us scholarship that we haven't known for 300 years, as you point out, since 1707, both here tonight and in your books. And thank you all very much for your questions and for your participation this evening.